Hello, hello. Today's episode is all about cannabis and exercise. I'm chatting with professor and researcher Dr. Angela Bryan about the science behind how cannabis helps with exercise and why and how this could be a new frontier for motivating people to get active. I'm going to add the links to some of Dr. Bryan's awesome research in the show notes of this episode if you want to give them a read. Later on, we're also going to talk with another researcher, Dr. Whitney Ogle, who is going to talk more about the community aspect, her personal experience, and how we can connect research and the community members to further our understanding of the intersection of cannabis and exercise. Personally speaking, I'm only going to exercise if I use cannabis. I find it helpful for motivation, enjoyment, recovery, especially helping me get into the flow state and enhancing the mind-body connection. Many people also use it to lessen inflammation or pain during exercise or other reasons that we don't discuss in this episode. As always, thank you to the patrons of this podcast. You can join the Bioactive Patreon for as little as $1 a month and ask guest questions ahead of time, send me DMs, and get exclusive content. If you want a completely free way to support me on the podcast, please consider leaving a review on Apple or Spotify. Here, I'll give you a second to do that right now. It's that easy, and it's the best way to help grow this community. I think next week, we're going to mix it up a little bit with an episode on DMT, what we know about it, and some absolutely fascinating research on DMT and the visual cortex. I'm also going to start uploading the nap time episodes with Dr. Miyabi Shields on Tuesdays so I can release more of them each season. Anyway, thank you for listening and spending the next hour or so with me. I'm glad you're here, and mad love, my friends. Well, welcome back to the Bioactive Podcast. Today, I'm so excited. We have Dr. Angela Bryan, who is a professor of psychology and neuroscience at the University of Colorado, Boulder. And today, we are talking about the science of cannabis and exercise. So from a community standpoint, we know that so many people are using cannabis for exercise, whether that's motivation, recovery, mindset, whatever it is. But let's really dive into the science today. So, Dr. Bryan, welcome to the podcast. If you could just give a little bit more background on your research interests, and then we'll start to dive into the subject.
Sure. Thanks so much for having me, Riley. It's really exciting to share this research with the public and tell them what we're up to. I wanted to give a little bit of background about how I came to this research topic. It's not one that you'd sort of pick out of a hat as a logical thing to do research on, but my training is as a health psychologist. So I've spent a lot of my career trying to encourage people to do healthy things like physical activity, healthy diet, condom use, and also trying to help them decrease their risk behavior. So things like heavy alcohol use or heavy cannabis use. So when cannabis legalization happened, I was at a place where I was thinking, what are the implications of this for the things that I study? And one of the things I immediately thought of was, okay, if we're going to legalize something, that if we just think about the stereotypical cannabis user, someone who, gets the munchies, has couch lock, that doesn't go along with healthy diet and physical activity. So for me, I was really concerned about the negative impacts of cannabis on things like obesity and type 2 diabetes. But what I've actually found is that it may actually be good for those things.
I love that already, that, I assumed that the stoner stereotype was going to come into this research in some way, right? Like couch lock, lazy, you get the munchies, you're eating too much. But we have so much data on the impact of cannabis on metabolism. And actually, that's going to be a whole nother topic for a future episode. But even the sense that you get the munchies, that should initiate something.
I do research on that too.
No way. Oh my gosh. That we might have to have a whole separate episode on that because this is so interesting. But yeah, we don't really see that on a population-wide level with cannabis users being excessively overweight. But what you're saying is kind of the opposite of the stigma that we may have had in our head about cannabis users. It might be just the opposite, where cannabis could actually help people become more healthy and maybe encourage people to exercise or maybe encourage people to eat healthier. So, right off the bat, I think that's so interesting. So, you were interested from kind of a community health standpoint to say, okay, we're experiencing all this legalization. What does that mean when we have an increase in cannabis use, making sure that people remain healthy? And
Yeah.
did you have any like lived experience with this? Have you ever tried cannabis and exercise and said, that was really fun? Or anybody you know, maybe you've talked to people and.
Sure. I mean, the answer is both. Certainly we initially started looking into the cannabis and exercise literature once we found out, like you said, that actually, from an epidemiological perspective, cannabis users have less risk of type 2 diabetes, better waist to hip ratio, lower BMI. And then in some survey work we did, they're also more likely to meet physical activity guidelines. So that was all sort of mind blowing. But we combine that with, I mean, we live in Boulder, Colorado, so there's a lot of people who do a lot of physical activity, lots of endurance athletes. And what we were hearing from the community is that this is something that's helpful to them. So people who, need to do a long training run or ride or hike, they were telling us, you take an edible before and it makes the workout more pleasant, makes it, feel like the time goes by faster. Certainly, I've tried it on a run before, and certainly all of those experiences combined, both from the literature and also from anecdotal experience, suggest that this might be a tool that we could use to maybe help people to be more active.
I love that. So, what you're kind of finding, and we'll dive into the research more because I'm just so curious about methodology of testing people before, during, after exercise. But
Yeah.
kind of in general, what you're seeing through your research is that it increases the motivation or the likelihood of people like wanting to get out and exercise, but not maybe necessarily. Have you seen any association with it making people better at exercise, either lifting more or running longer, swimming longer? Have you seen any sort of
No,
that?
in fact, quite the opposite. Cannabis is decidedly not a performance enhancing drug. And the effects on motivation are a little bit indirect. So, in my sort of previous research on physical activity, one of the things that we know just in terms of who is more physically active, how do we get people to maintain, it turns out that people who enjoy physical activity, who have a positive affective response to physical activity, are more likely to do it again. They're more likely to want to do it again. It's not rocket science, right? So if it feels good, we want to do it again. If it doesn't feel good, we don't want to do
Right.
it again. So for people who exercise feels good, makes them feel happier, gives them more positive affect, they're more likely to do it. And that's exactly what we see when people exercise under the influence of cannabis. They have a more positive affective response to exercise. They experience more of that euphoria and feelings of strength that we associate with the runner's high. And so because the experience is more positive, that makes it more likely that people are going to want to do it again. So I wouldn't say that, you could be sitting on the couch, take an edible, and think, ooh, I want to go exercise. It doesn't work that way. It's more if you take it concurrent with exercise, it can make the exercise feel more pleasant. Even if it maybe feels a little more effortful and you're slower, you have more fun doing it, so you're more likely to do it again.
Man, there is just so much here, just from like a personal perspective. I haven't read all the literature on this, but I've read quite a bit, and I've read your studies as well. Would you mind kind of talking about, from a physiological level, what you think cannabis might be doing that's kind of helping people get motivated to exercise or enjoy it more, or any
Sure.
sort of hypothesis of what's happening here?
For a long time, we thought that what was making us have that positive affective response, have that feeling of euphoria, we thought it was the endogenous opiate system that was doing that work. So endorphins, right? And
Yeah.
I haven't done this work, but there's a lot of work that shows that that's not actually the case. So it's not the opiate system. That's not what's making those feelings happen. What we think, actually, the research is tending towards. I wouldn't say it's definitive at this point, but we think it actually might be the endocannabinoid system, right? So we have cannabinoid receptors throughout the body. They're concentrated in the central nervous system, so the brain and spinal column, but they're all over the body, all in the periphery, in our muscles. And when we are active, our muscles release endocannabinoids, so endogenous cannabinoids that link up to those cannabinoid receptors. So, what we think is happening when we add exogenous cannabinoids to the system is we're kind of just bumping up that effect, right? Intensifying it a little bit, making it feel, a little stronger than it might otherwise. But that's one of the reasons that cannabis, works so well in our bodies, because we have these receptors that are specifically geared towards receiving those cannabinoids. So we think that might be what the physiological mechanism is that helps us to achieve those states. And like I said, those cannabinoid receptors are concentrated in the central nervous system in the brain. So you mentioned something about the mind body connection. We know that mindfulness during various physical activities can be really helpful. My boyfriend actually just gave me a book on mindful running that I'm going to have to read eventually. But we think that
Cool.
we think that those endocannabinoid receptors and the interplay with the exogenous cannabinoids is probably doing a lot of the work here.
A lot of the previous research, we thought it was all these opiates that our body was
Yeah.
producing. But
Yeah.
later, more recent research is saying, I think it might be less opiates and more endocannabinoids.
Yeah.
So it would make sense why you get that high feeling, that euphoric, that amazing feeling after you run. So if you
Hmm.
could actually just take that feeling and put it before the run, then you can enjoy the run and your body's going to still release those after the run. So you kind of
Right.
enjoy the entire experience instead of just after the run, which might be the case
Right.
with people who are just, raw dogging life and aren't using cannabis. Um,
Yeah.
I would love to. I would love to dive into the methodology more on your
Sure.
studies with cannabis and exercise, because I'm sure there was some barriers to researching this, because cannabis in general is very difficult to study still, because it is still a Schedule One drug that very likely
Mhm.
might change soon, but it is still a Schedule One
Yeah.
drug, and oftentimes these types of studies are looking at human blood, human biomarkers, which is another and very difficult thing to research. So, what was the process like designing these studies, and was it difficult to get it approved by your academic institution? Were they kind of like, "Oh, we can't be doing that here," or what was that process like?
Well, going back to legalization, my colleagues and I initially thought, oh, this is great. It's legal. We're going to, buy a volcano, put it on campus. We're going to buy different kinds of flower products and let people use them in the lab. And we went to our IRB, the ethical board who approves research studies, and they were like, oh, no, you're not. um, and so that
You are not
started.
putting a volcano in this
Yeah.
building.
Exactly. That started work with the legal team, with the administration, and with the ethics board to think about, and I should say that all of our goals were the same, right? How can we do this research? Because we all felt like the legalization cart was way before the research horse, right? We all of a sudden had access to just
Yeah.
thousands of different kinds of products and zero data about what they do to people, what the potential benefits might be, what the potential harms might be, what people might need to know before they purchase these products and use them. So everybody was thinking about how can we get the
Yeah.
research done, which I have to give a lot of credit to the University of Colorado that they were always looking for ways to help us facilitate the work. But like you said, it's illegal at the federal level. And because of the Drug Free Schools Act, we are not allowed to have cannabis on campus. We can't give it to people. We can't buy it for them. We can't tell them what to take. We can't tell them how much to take. Um, so we had to find a way around that. And the way that we have found to do that, and I'll give two different examples when I talk about these two exercise studies. But for the most part, the way that we've gotten around the regulations, or more appropriately, worked within the regulations, is we use a mobile pharmacology laboratory. Some people call it the Canavan. And what we do in most of our studies is we bring people into the lab, we do informed consent, we do a bunch of baseline measures, and then we schedule a time for the van to come to their house. We drive the van to their house. They come out to the van. We draw blood so that we can make sure they don't already have cannabinoids on board. We do whatever pre-assessments that we're doing, whether it's a study on anxiety or pain or other kinds of effects. We ask them to go back into their house. They use their product. So that way, all of the product use happens inside the house without us watching them.
Wait, can I ask one question? Okay, sorry, keep going. I was just gonna ask if you were providing the product to everyone, if that was the same product that everyone gets, or if they're using their preferred product.
Depends on the study. In the exercise study where we used this technology, we actually partnered with a dispensary who made pre-rolls for us. One pre-roll was a CBD dominant cannabis flower. The other pre-roll was a THC dominant flower. So, and then we asked participants to go and buy one or the other. But since we can't be there with them at the store, and we can't verify their purchases, that's why we draw blood, right? To make sure that they used a product while they were inside the house, to assess how much of it they used, and also to make sure that they used the product that we thought they were going to use, whether it's a THC or a CBD product. So
Okay, gotcha.
that's sort of the typical format of these studies, is that we use the van so that people aren't driving themselves under the influence, and that we can capture their responses right after they use their product. Now, the exercise study was a little different, right? Because we don't have a treadmill in the back of the van.
Right.
So what we had to do there was to bring participants back to the laboratory after they had used their product. And so we drove to their house. We drew blood. They went inside their house and used their product. Came back out to the van. We drew blood and then drove them back to the laboratory so that we could have them run in a controlled environment on the treadmill, with a research assistant there for safety. So that's how that study worked. And participants they either used a CBD product or a THC product, and then they also did the exact same run, not under the influence. And I should say that in both conditions, we still sent the van to their house, even though they weren't using anything, because we wanted everything to match about those two sessions, except the fact that they were using cannabis or not.
I love that. That makes a lot of sense for just controlling variables. So this study that we're referring to right now, that was specifically evaluating running, not necessarily weightlifting or
Right,
biking or other forms
right.
of exercise. This was specifically looking at running. When you were acquiring participants for the study, one, was it easy to get people to participate? I would think it would be really easy. And two, were you looking for people who already had some sort of experience and tolerance to cannabis, or was it kind of open to whoever wants to become the lab rat?
Yeah, so because we needed to make sure that people were going to be safe running on a treadmill under the influence of cannabis, we had to recruit people who already do this. So one thing that I talk about a lot is, we don't necessarily recommend that you pop a 5 milligram edible and jump on a treadmill, if you've never done that before, because certainly cannabis can cause things like dizziness and unsteadiness. So we needed to make sure that these are people who are comfortable doing this. We were just essentially watching them do something that they have done before and comparing it to a session where they weren't using cannabis. The other thing that's important to note is that we, in that first session where they did informed consent and they filled out a bunch of preliminary questionnaires, we also assessed their fitness so that we could make sure that the two treadmill runs were matched in terms of intensity for them, right? So we wanted it to be a moderate intensity physical activity. We wanted them to have the opportunity to feel good, so that it wasn't too intense and that it also wasn't boring. And so the two exercise events were matched in terms of the speed of the treadmill, the incline, and the duration of the run.
What were the overall results of the study? I know you mentioned that cannabis, it doesn't appear that cannabis is a performance enhancing drug, which is great news to so many professional athletes that use it
Yeah.
for recovery and motivation and like that mind body connection. I think very few people would tell you that it's like definitely a performance enhancing drug. So that's
Mhm.
fantastic. What were the other results, and what kind of data were you piecing together to tell this story? I know you mentioned, looking at the biomarkers in the blood. Were you
Mhm.
also doing survey data on the participants for their
Yes.
overall experience in the study, or, what did that kind of look like when you were putting together all the pieces?
Yeah, so all of the above, right? So we looked at the blood to make sure that people used the product they said they were going to use, that they hadn't used cannabis on the day they said they hadn't. So that's nice that we can verify cannabinoid exposure in the two sessions. What we found in terms of the survey measures, and I should say these are some of these measures we did before and after the run, some were actually during the run. So we know that affective response to physical activity, it's critical to measure it during physical activity because everybody feels great once they're done, right? That's not so informative. What we want to know is how do you feel while you're doing it, right? So some of the measures are during, and then some are after the run is over. But in general, what we found is that people had a more positive affective response to physical activity, to their running, when they were in the cannabis condition. Um, but it felt harder. So their ratings of perceived exertion were higher. And we think that that's largely
Okay.
due to the effect of THC on heart rate. So heart rate and perceived exertion are inextricably linked. That's kind of how we decide how hard we're exerting ourselves as we look to our heart rate. Um, and the other thing that we found is that feelings of euphoria, strength, that runner's high that people talk about was enhanced in the cannabis condition, but surprisingly, even more in the CBD condition. And I think the jury's still out about that particular finding because it's counterintuitive, right? Because THC is the psychoactive cannabinoid. It seems odd that CBD would be the one that had even a bigger boost in terms of runner's high. And then the last thing is that we looked at pain. You mentioned that athletes sometimes use cannabis to decrease pain associated with workouts, either during or after. And we've seen that too in our survey studies. We didn't see any effects on pain, but the reason is that these were all super fit, bolder runners who run a lot farther and faster than typically, and so they're not really experiencing any pain to be lessened. And so I think that was just a floor effect problem that we just didn't see much pain. The other thing I wanted to point out about the performance enhancing part, the other study that we did on this, we did a remote study where we asked people who have experience running, under the influence of cannabis. We asked them to do their own typical running route, outside in nature, wherever they usually do it. Um, Once using their favorite cannabis product and once without. And most of the findings were the
Mm-hmm.
same. Although, keep in mind here, the distance was the same, but we didn't make any restrictions on like time or speed or anything like that. And what we found in that study was even more striking that running the exact same route, people were 31 seconds per mile slower using cannabis. And I don't know if you're a runner or not,
Ooh.
but 31 seconds per mile is a lot. That's much slower.
Yes,
So,
I used to be a runner, not so much anymore. In high school, I was doing the track and field and all of that stuff, and I still dabble a little bit, but I am not surprised by that at all, to be
Yeah,
honest. Just from my
yeah,
friends who are active runners, and I think a lot of people who are running for their kind of just health and well-being are often not trying to hit like a specific time either. It's just about getting
right,
out there, exercising your body and doing it, which is kind
right.
of in line with what you're talking about. If we can just get people to be out more doing stuff, that's really what matters. It doesn't matter if you're hitting a PR every time you go out. It's more about just like exercising your body, enjoying it, and wanting to do it again.
Yeah, I mean, like I say, and again, like going back to sort of first principles, why am I interested in this at all? It's not because I want to improve the performance of Olympic athletes. It's because I want people to get off the couch. I want them
Right.
to move their body in ways that they enjoy so that they'll do it again, so that they'll be healthier. So, with that in mind as the goal, you're absolutely right. I could care less if they go slower when they're doing that. You know, the other thing that's interesting about, I get asked questions about either smoked or vaped cannabis versus edibles. And certainly we need more research on this because the study that we did in the lab was all smoked. It was all those pre rolls. But the remote study that we did, people used everything. They used, edibles. They used high potency concentrates. They used flour. We saw no differences between all those different forms. So we know that people are going to be using different forms. And all of those different forms have different pros and cons, right? So, one of the differences
Yeah.
between smoked and edible is that a smoked product takes effect very quickly and the effects also dissipate very quickly, right? So, it's entirely possible that you could drive to a gym, smoke a joint outside, go in and work out, and be totally fine to drive home. But that
Yeah.
is maybe not so
Right.
much the case edible where it lasts for upwards of 30, 40, 50 minutes, an hour, 2 hours. Then we have to be more careful about those sustained effects. So
Man, there's a lot of complexities to cannabis. I love that there was different consumption methods included in that first study and that people kind of had the ability to choose. And of course, what you're talking about, there's so many variables when you allow for different consumption methods. But it's interesting
yeah,
that you didn't see anything, drastically different. But it's cool too from a community standpoint, from what I've heard from other people and what I do with myself, is if you have a longer run or you have a longer workout or a longer swim, that you can kind of curate your consumption method to that level of exercise. So if you need a longer run, then maybe you take an edible because those effects are going to last a couple hours. Whereas if you're just in the gym for like a quick pump and maybe you're only there for 45 minutes, maybe vaping or smoking is the right way to go about that. But it's like you can really curate your experience to what you're looking for in the gym with your cannabis product.
and I think that's one of the reasons we didn't find differences between the different forms in that first study because we told people do what you normally do. And so they're doing what they have done before that works for them. So it might be that for you an edible works great and for me I don't like it. It kind of makes me dizzy. I'd rather, smoke a joint before. So I think like you said, people are curating their own experience and doing what works for them. And so that's probably why we don't see big differences between the forms in that study because we let people pick what they wanted to use. So I think what will be really interesting is when we can, do some laboratory studies where we randomly assign people to either use a smokable form or an edible form and see what the differences are in terms of their experience.
Mm.
But that's a study to be done in the future.
Oh, yeah. I want to definitely end this episode talking about just your ideas for future studies because I think that would be really interesting. But I did have a couple additional questions on the products or the flour that we're referring to in the second study with the pre
Yeah,
rolls.
yeah,
So you said you had two different varieties, a CBD
yep,
dominant and a THC dominant. Do you
yes.
know anything about the terpene profiles, or were these half gram joints or full gram joints when choosing the different products? Were you asking the dispensary, like, hey guys, what has worked for you? Or, what do people come in and buy products for exercise? How did you kind of refine, like, there's so many different strains out there, which two did you choose and how did you kind of go about that process?
Right. Well, so far in our work, even though we measure things like terpene profiles and minor cannabinoids, we really haven't seen any measurable effects of any of them. They're very difficult to detect in blood. The levels are very, very low. So, in terms of scientific evidence about what any of the minor cannabinoids or terpenes do, we don't actually know. No one does. Certainly, like you said, dispensary owners and growers and bud tenders have their opinions, but they're just that, opinions. What we do know makes a big difference is THC and CBD, and that's really all we have data on. So,
Yes.
what we were looking for is and we purposefully picked things that were popular, right? So, what's a popular THC dominant strain that a lot of people use? Because ultimately, we want our studies to be applicable to the general public, right? And so we don't want to be studying products that no one uses.
Love that. Love that.
That actually drove the decision about the CBD product because there just aren't that many on the market. Like, unless you go to a hemp specific store or unless you're on in the medical cannabis market, there aren't a whole lot of high CBD strains out there. So we kind of had to take what they had. We had very little choice from that perspective. People could use as much or as little as they wanted, and people did. Some used very little, some used the whole joint, and we had the kind of full range of that in the study.
I found it really interesting when you talked about CBD kind of having a greater correlation with that runner's high feeling. I'm like still kind of hung up on that.
Me
I think
too.
that's really really interesting. And so I have studied the chemical transformation of cannabinoids in cannabis smoke, like during the smoking process. And I'm curious if part of what we're seeing is because these people did smoke that CBD product, that pre roll. And we see so many, like CBD can chemically transform into THC, into these other minor cannabinoids that kind of act similar to THC. And I'm curious if we would see the same sort of correlation with like a CBD tincture. Did you see in your study any differences between women and men and their response to cannabis and exercise, and just in general the metrics that they were experiencing, if it was positive, if it was negative, or like the biomarkers, the outcomes?
Yeah, the both of the studies, actually, I think the remote study was more balanced, but the laboratory study was more men than women. But we had men and women in both. Both of them were relatively small studies, so we didn't probably have the power that we might like to be able to test gender differences, but we didn't see any in either study.
I always like to ask because just the endocannabinoid system in general. You see so many different sex differences, especially with women typically having a little bit more like fat on their bodies, and how the ECS is a fat signaling system, and these compounds are stored in fat. So it's always just something that's in the back of my mind. So that's really interesting.
Male and female bodies metabolize cannabinoids differently. So there's definitely, you make an excellent point. There's the possibility that we might see differences if we had larger samples of both. I think that it's possible. I also think that what might be happening is that, like we keep saying, people titrate to their own, to the experience that they'd like to have, right? And so we know that typically, the male body has a higher tolerance to THC, feels in one of our studies somewhat less high, even with the same level of THC on board, so than women do. So I think there's definitely potential for those differences. We probably just didn't have the power to see them in our studies.
Something to look forward to researching in the future. And I'm sure that your research is also just inspiring so many people to look into this more. Have your published results, because now you've published at least two pretty impactful papers on this subject, what has the response been like from the cannabis community, from consumers, from other research scientists? Is it mostly positive? Are people kind of like questioning everything they've ever thought about cannabis? What's that been like?
Well, actually, there's a whole research interest group on cannabis and exercise that people in my lab are a part of. It was one of the founders was Dr. Whitney Ogle, who's at Humboldt State University, who's been trying to do this work for a long time. We have the ability to do more of the in-person work than she does at her institution, but she's really one of the leaders in the field, and so she's brought together this community of researchers who are all interested in this same thing. So there's actually a lot of
Oh,
interest,
cool.
even before these studies were published. I think we're all sort of, trying to do what we can within the constraints of the legal status of cannabis, to try to add to the conversation. I really haven't had pushback in a negative way from any source. I think partially because we try to take a very balanced perspective, right? Like we don't position cannabis as a panacea that's going to get everyone to be meeting physical activity requirements. It's not that, and certainly for some people, it's not the right answer. But we're trying to position it as a tool in the toolbox to help people to get and stay active and to enjoy the physical activity that they're doing.
I love that. Do you think there's any even survey data out there on the type of exercise and how that relates to the how well cannabis can kind of integrate into it, or if it's kind of a blanket statement? Because I know, like, personally, I love using cannabis in swimming. I just think it's like the most beautiful feeling. Your sensory perception is like heightened and you're underwater. It's very playful, it's very unique environment. But, I've also used it while running. I've also used it while, golfing. Does anybody golf completely sober? I'm not sure. But definitely, golfers.
It's so funny that you mentioned golfing because in one of our studies with older adults and physical activity, and we measured whether or not they used cannabis. It wasn't a study about cannabis, but one of our older adult participants said that he always does an edible before he golfs because then his knee feels better and he can walk the whole, nine holes. So yeah, totally. What we do know from our survey studies and other survey studies is that people are using it for all different activities, right? So for weightlifting, for yoga, that's one I'd like to try actually. For swimming, for biking, for hiking, for running. So there's just so many different ways that people are using it, and I think what we know now is that the types of use are quite varied. We don't have a systematic assessment of which kinds of experiences you have during which kinds of activities, but certainly that's a place we'd like to get to eventually.
Oh, I can't wait to see all your future research. I think this is such a wide open field of study because there's so many people who have been doing it for so long, but kind of just in secrecy because
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, it wasn't very well accepted. And, if you told people that, they would probably bring up the stigma of cannabis users saying, that doesn't make any sense to me. So a lot of people in the community kind of just been hiding their cannabis use. But I will also say I create a lot of social media content around not yeah, cannabis in general. And I've my one of my first videos that ever went like viral, which was a crazy feeling, but crazy like viral on TikTok. I was talking about cannabis and exercise, and I was trying to gather community data. And I said, like, we have all this evidence for cannabis and exercise. Can you comment on this post if it helped with, I think it was motivation, like sensory recovery or something else. There was four options. I remember that, and a lot of people said recovery too, and
Hmm.
whether that's
Yeah.
using cannabis after to initiate like stretching, and stretching such a beautiful feeling when you're using cannabis as well, but also just like even expanding beyond smoking and vaping and edibles, topicals are amazing for cannabis and recovery to like really hone in on a specific area of your body and provide those cannabinoids to that localized area. So I think there's so much room for expansion of really learning what have people been doing, what area of exercise is cannabis helping with, and how can we kind of refine the studies that we're doing to try to help people kind of guide them towards what dose might be helpful, what product types might be helpful. I think it's just I think it's just going to be so interesting. Have you done any research with topicals in the past, or have you personally used topicals?
Yeah, we haven't. I've actually had a CBD massage, which was magical.
Ooh,
But and that was certainly a topical products. We haven't done topical research, but actually, the last time I was at the International Cannabinoid Research Society meeting, it was in Ireland a couple of years ago, and there's some great research going on in terms of topicals and delivery systems and how to make sure they're actually getting under the skin and so I think that's
amazing.
another area where we definitely need to see more research. You know, the other thing that you're talking about in terms of public perception, one thing that I like to remind people when we're in conversation about this is, you mentioned earlier, you know, out there raw dogging your exercise, right? Like not using anything. Um, there's actually a lot of different things that we use when we're physically active. Like if you pick up any of the, you know, the goos and gels and, you know, for runners, they're all loaded with caffeine now, right? So we've determined, okay, caffeine's an acceptable drug to, you know, enhance your physical activity. A lot of people take Advil before they go for a run. So there's certainly other
Hmm.
things, that other chemical substances that we have learned interact with the body to help us to enjoy physical activity, and you know, cannabis might just be another one of those. And so I think if we put it in that sort of broader framework of, you know, things that we can use to enhance our experience or make it more fun or help us to get out there, that's a really good way to think about it, and just put it in context.
I'm so glad you brought this up because I remember in college, I tried pre workout for the first time. I think it was C4 pre workout. And I didn't know what pre workout was at this time. I was just like with somebody going to the gym and they're like, put a scoop in your water bottle, shake that up, and chug it. And I'm like, awesome. So I did that. I think that was the first time I experienced heart palpitations. Like I was shaking out of my skin. I was going
Mhm.
insane. And I was kind of like, one, how is this legal? Like this feels like an illegal stimulant. My I want
Yeah.
to jump out of my skin. And then like the safety of that versus the safety of cannabis products, I would love to see a comparison because I'm almost fully convinced that cannabis is significantly safer. And I'd also just love to touch upon that subject of like populations of people who maybe shouldn't use cannabis and exercise,
Yeah.
or what is like, what is the way to go about exploring this for the first time to make sure we're doing it in a safe way for you and everyone around you while you're exercising?
Right. So the safety issues are the same for cannabis and exercise as they would be for cannabis for any other purpose, right? So whether you're wanting to use it recreationally or for exercise or for anxiety or whatever the purpose is, you know, we'd have the same safety recommendations. So for anyone who has psychosis, serious mental illness in their family history, we know that you're at increased risk of psychosis associated with cannabis use. So that's definitely a concern. For anyone who struggles with things like vertigo or being unsteady, those things become much more common as we get older. Being very careful to see how cannabis affects you before you start doing something like getting on a treadmill or riding a bike or doing anything that would compromise your balance. And then generally, like we always tell people, start low, go slow, right? So if you're going to use a THC product that has
Yes.
those effects on things like balance, then start with a very low dose. If you know you have an edible that's like a 10 milligram gummy, cut it in half, then cut it in half again. You know, start out with maybe 2.5 milligrams
Yes.
of THC, see how that affects you. Wait at least an hour before you take more. So all of the same safety concerns that we would talk to people about before they use cannabis for any reason would be the same ones we talk about in terms of physical activity. I think the other thing is, you know, to not do brand new activities for the first time under the influence, right? Like, you know, any activity that you're not super familiar with. So for me, you know, I swim as cross training, but I'm not very good at it. So I am not going to be using cannabis during swimming because I'm just barely not drowning anyway. But
Yeah.
for me, you know, running on a treadmill is something I'm super comfortable with, or running outside or running on a trail. So I think making sure that you're very comfortable with the activity before you then layer cannabis use onto it to see how those things feel together.
That's fantastic advice. Thank you for that. And I would also just, this is my personal experience, I would add on too, like if you are going for a long run or a hike or whatever, bring a friend, especially if you have a friend who also maybe likes to consume small amounts, and you can do that together and like build that relationship at the same time, while you're kind of exploring this together. And I cannot emphasize the start low and go slow enough. Like it's okay if you do an exercise and you don't feel high, but you say, okay, maybe next time I'm going to try a little bit more. That wasn't enough. Like it might take you a few trips in order to get to the correct dose. And when you find that dose, stay there as long as you can. That's your sweet spot, and keep using the same products too, because we know different strains can have wildly different amounts of THC, CBD, terpenes can make you feel different. So maybe like when you're new to it, like really starting to focus on the same product, but locking in that specific dose might be a good like first step there.
Absolutely. And I want to reinforce that being active with people, making it a social activity, is good to help you be physically active, whether you're using cannabis or not. So let me just reinforce, definitely exercise with friends, make it social. That's another way to make it fun.
I love that. Um, and just kind of I want to just touch on like your overarching research kind of as we're getting towards the end of this. You were really talking about, we have this obesity epidemic. I'm not sure if that's the right way to introduce it, but obviously, like a lot of Americans struggle with their weight. And this is a very unconventional way, I would say, of looking at the obesity epidemic and saying, okay, well, what are people already doing? What's helping people? Can we look into this more? Are there other things you're looking at, whether it's other natural products, other things involving cannabis, like systematically, what's going on here? And like, how are we exploring this from a scientific perspective and trying to help as many people as possible?
Sure. So that actually brings me to the research project that I mentioned earlier on metabolism. So, what we're actually doing in two separate studies is looking at the influence of use of different forms of cannabis, either a CBD dominant product, a THC dominant product, or one that's more like a one-to-one product. And we're looking at the both acute and longer term impacts of use of these products on insulin function, on glucose metabolism, on inflammation, to try to get a sense of what's underlying that finding that cannabis users have less risk of type 2 diabetes, right? Because that's all about insulin function and glucose metabolism. And those things are linked to inflammation. We know cannabis is anti-inflammatory. Might that be the mechanism? So it's maybe not driven by physical activity or diet. Maybe it's actually driven by something metabolic that's changing in cannabis users as compared to non-users. So we actually bring people in and do an oral glucose tolerance test after they've used cannabis to try to see what the acute impacts are of that use. And we also have people changing the product that they're using for 4 weeks to see if we see any changes in those biomarkers. So far, what we're finding is that, at least in the longer term study, it looks like the major differences are between users and non-users. That once you're a fairly consistent user, which product you use doesn't seem to have a huge influence. But being a user is associated with lower inflammatory biomarkers. So it's super cool work, very metabolic. We do measure physical activity and diet, but that one is heavily focused on the more metabolic aspect of what cannabis does to the body.
Wow. And was this looking at people who have been using cannabis like their whole life? I know there's previous research on people who started using cannabis younger, maybe it's 14 or 15 years old, and metabolic differences there. Or is this like you're acutely using cannabis and that's causing acute effects on your metabolism?
So there are two different studies actually. So the study that's the longer term study, these people are mostly daily users, and they've been daily users for at least about a year. So in terms of lifetime use, we have a lot of variability there in terms of when they started. But in our other study, we're actually recruiting people who are infrequent users and asking them to use a particular product once so we can look at acute effects. So stay tuned for those findings. We'll have more on that soon.
Awesome. Also, your dog sounds so much like my dog when my dog's like, "Can I go outside and play?" Like right
I know.
now.
I'm sitting
So
right
I
by the
love
back
that.
door, and they're like, "Come on."
Well, I promise we're almost done, but I need to ask you a question because you might be the only person that knows the answer to this question, or has any
Okay.
hypothesis. Have you seen any sort of association with cannabis users and GLP-1 agonists like Ozempic affecting the way that they feel cannabis?
Um, no, but I think that's one of the next great frontiers. So one of my graduate students actually is doing work on, Ozempic and our perceptions of it and how it influences things like weight stigma. I think there's so many cool research questions to ask. One of my collaborators on the study I just mentioned is an endocrinologist whose main interest is in obesity, and she has a lot of interest in looking at these newer drugs and how they affect weight. So I think we're getting there, but yeah, right now I don't know.
Okay, I've just received, I mean, thank you for that answer. I've received so many direct messages saying, "Hey, I'm on Ozempic and I can't feel my cannabis products anymore," or just like these crazy
Wow.
stories. And of course, more and more and more people are on Ozempic now. So this is
Yep.
becoming more popular. And I'm scouring the research, just looking for like somebody to publish something about the ECS and Ozempic. And of course, the
Yep.
ECS is involved in everything. So there's something there. But I know there's an association there happening, and of course the effects on metabolism. Like we're going to see a link here in the future, and I think you or somebody you know in your labs are going to be the person to unveil that. So the second you hear anything about that, please let me know because I'm so curious.
Definitely. Yeah, I think like I said, it's one of the next great frontiers out there for sure.
Awesome. So we're going to wrap up this episode, and I'm just going to ask you a couple final questions, and then we'll let you go on with your day, take your dog for a walk, whatever you want to do. But I guess one question would be, how do people how do people become a participant in one of your studies if they are someone who's so passionate about cannabis and exercise and they want to be involved in this? Do they have to live in Colorado, or how do people get involved?
Yeah, for the remote study, that could have been just about anyone. But for our studies that involve the van and driving the van to people's houses, we can really only go about an hour outside of the Boulder, Denver area. But if people are in that area, then going to our website is the easiest way to get involved. And if you just Google CU Change Colorado, you'll be immediately taken to our center's website. So that's a real easy one. But yeah, we're always looking for participants to be in our studies. And I have to say that we have been so heartened to see how interested people are in this work, how important they think it is. The people that we work with in our research studies, they want the answers to these questions just as badly as we do. And so it's been great to work with the public and have them help us to find these answers.
That's amazing, and I just want to let you know that your research is incredibly validating to our community. This is something that we have known that cannabis helps with exercise for a long time from a lived experience, personal perspective, but we never were able to like directly cite studies and say, look, it's not just me, science says this, and your studies are
Yeah.
providing the resource for us to communicate this with maybe people who don't see eye to eye, and it's an amazing communication tool for us. So thank you so much for putting that work out there and really representing our community in a positive way, validating our feelings, and pushing forward with the benefits of cannabis as medicine.
Yeah, I really appreciate your thoughts. It's so exciting when you feel like your research has an actual impact, both to the science but also to the public. So it's really validating to hear you say that as well.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to be on this podcast. I've really enjoyed this conversation. I learned a lot, and I can't wait for all the listeners to hear it as well.
Great, I'm so glad, and it was really nice to talk to you, Riley. Thanks so much for having me.